Good morning, everyone. I attended the conference my name is Dr. Troy Gordon, by the way, so if you want to look at my bio in the program, you're welcome to do that. I attended the conference last year, and I found the discussions very vital. I'm not a human resources or a human capital expert, as will become very clear from my talk, but I very much thank Sasha and Patrick for launching these discussions because I think that they're very vital. I was thinking back to my very last day of university when I had a job interview. I'd always sort of worked from the age of 16, but sort of my first formal job interview, because I grew up just outside of Seattle, it was with the Boeing Company, and it was in the Human Resources Department with the Boeing Company to be the assistant to the Director of Human Resources for a particular division, and I did not get the job. And certainly if that person were here now, he would be very grateful that he didn't hire me. A year ago, my PhD dissertation director retired, and I gave a talk at the retirement event for her, and the talk ended up being somewhat of a diatribe against the human resourcification of higher education, which is what I called it at the time. And while I agree with the gentleman in the back that universities have been globalized for centuries, it's only been fairly recently that they have been dominated by human resources departments. And certainly in the way that we think about our professional identities, we're very much given over to a human resources paradigm and a legal paradigm. So I'd like to talk about that today. And I'm going to be very critical of human resources, and I want to expose its limitations and try to make visible those things that it hides or that it cannot see. You can tell from my bio and from what I'm going to talk about that I'm a scholar of the humanities and of feminist theory. And this, when I showed a colleague of mine my proposal for this conference, she said, "Oh, well, there's a book." So in 20 minutes, I'm going to sort of give you the beginnings of my thinkings about the subject of gender and study abroad. And I would prefer to talk, but because of the 20-minute time limit, which I very much respect, I will end up reading somewhat. So thank you for that. Let's start with a nice definition of human resources. This is from a standard textbook published by Pearson called Business Essentials, an introductory textbook, the 8th edition, published in 2011. Listen carefully to the adjectives in what I'm about to read. Effectively managed human resources are the lifeblood of an organization. Successful firms develop clear, consistent approaches to staffing, training, evaluating, and compensating employees. If you involve people, they become more committed and productive. It's a great sentence. This chapter will help you understand the rationale behind the HR policies. Now, the two key nouns in that last sentence, I'll get to in a moment, rationale behind the policies, but the adjectives are an interesting string of words: managed, successful, clear, consistent, committed, productive. These adjectives tell us what we mostly already know, but I want to draw out some of the key features. Human resources is predominantly based on a legal, rational paradigm developed by the social sciences and by management science, often called rational management or classical management theory. It's fascinating to me that the very first topic on the board here in Sasha's list of very, very interesting topics happens to be legal matters, that the first question was a question that became a legal question and was turned over to Gianfranco, the lawyer. It's very, very easy for the law and for legal discourse to take over any discussion about our professional identities or about transnational education. I just want to sort of make that quick observation. Both the social sciences and rational management arose in the early 20th century, and both rely on a notion of science as authority and truth, so that even the study of or management of human beings is seen as scientific, meaning generalizable, predictable, empirical, rational, and in the end, true. In the world of human resources, employees are selected, trained, and developed in accordance with organizational objectives that are clearly defined and unproblematic. Organizations are assumed to be unitary wholes characterized by order and consensus. Now, in the last 30 to 40 years, a lot of management scholarship has become much more nuanced and has moved forward. But management practices and values and assumptions have often lagged behind, especially, I would argue, in the field of human resource management, which still relies on classical management science from the mid-20th century. Successful, clear, committed, productive, rational, and it always works. Structurally, rational management takes the dominant form of the bureaucracy. We take the features of bureaucracy for granted. For example, a division of labor, the specialization of roles, a hierarchical structure, a complete separation of the professional from the personal, the absence of emotion, the discipline of employees, and if you mess up, you attend a disciplinary hearing. The subordination of individual interests to the organization's interests, and above all, regulations and policies that are portrayed as impartial and equitable and defensible in a court of law. This is what I mean by a legal, rational paradigm. Welcome back. A quick anecdote. A friend of mine who works for a large organization in the state of Virginia in the United States was managing a department that had several very difficult personalities, and one person had substance abuse issues, one person had an elderly parent that they cared for, one person had chronic medical problems, and no one got along, and it was a very difficult department to manage, and they brought in a human resources consultant whose advice to the manager was, and I quote, "Just tell them not to bring personal issues into the office." Here is what this rational discourse of human resources looks like, and I'll just give you one particular example. A standard recruitment tool used by thousands of organizations, including the United Nations, is one called Competency-Based Interviews, or CBIs. I don't know if any of you have familiarity with this. But here's what it is. A job description is posted with the requisite skills and competencies listed. At the interview, a template is used. And as I was writing this, I realized I had slipped into passive voice. All of my verbs became passive voice, it's the voice of science, right? A template is used. As candidates are asked preset questions and asked to tell an anecdote demonstrating their experience and competency in that area. Now, the idea behind competency-based interviews, or CBIs, much like a lot of human resources, is laudable. They were designed to prevent nepotism, to prevent employers from asking irrelevant questions. They're designed, in other words, to be more fair to everyone, which is a hallmark of meritocracy. Now, if the employee uses an example from their experience that happens to be inadequate, then they fail that question. So here's a typical question. It might appear thus. Tell us about a time when you demonstrated such and such a skill. Fill in the blank. And here are some of the particular categories. You could Google this right now, and these questions that I'm asking would come up. So here are the areas where you must demonstrate competency: teamwork, communication, adaptability, compliance, this is not an exhaustive list, delegation, independence, integrity, sensitivity to others, resilience, decisiveness, leveraging diversity. I don't even know what that means. So, yes, exactly. But this is used by the United Nations as well. So here is a question that was asked at the United Nations in an interview with a simultaneous interpreter who was applying for a promotion to a higher grade within the United Nations. And the question was asked as follows. Tell us of an interpreter. Tell us about a time when your communication skills made a difference to a situation. Now, the key here is that the interviewers are not allowed to deviate from the script. And in fact, in that interview, someone asked a very specific question related to simultaneous interpretation into French. And the head interviewer stopped and said, "You cannot ask that question because it's not on the approved list." Now, this can certainly start to seem absurd, especially when you consider that the example that the interviewee uses doesn't even have to be true because no one will check it. But CBIs are widely used, and more to the point, they reveal human resources thinking. Perhaps at its extreme, but I don't think it's extreme as we would like to believe. Human resources attempts to standardize everything because being neutral, of course, means being fair, And the bottom line is, you have to cover yourself in case you're sued. So if the employee messes up, you can say, well, but it's not our fault because we ticked that box on the CBI. An interesting side note that you probably won't find anywhere, because I asked a CBI consultant, where did this come from? Who invented it? When was it developed? And it turns out that it was developed in the 1930s by a regime that knew a thing or two about bureaucracy. The Wehrmacht, the unified German army under the Nazis, created competency-based interviews to identify the most promising Aryan elements of the population who would make the best officers. I'm not making this up. Now, if you think that's extreme, consider the first use in the English language of the term human resources. And for this, I thank my colleague Forbes Morlock. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, it appeared in the Times nearly a century ago on the 17th of May, 1915, about a year into the Great War. A newly formed committee on the war was urged to, quote, take stock of the human resources still at the disposal of the nation. Human resources meant cannon fodder, in other words. When human as an adjective is followed by the noun resources, or capital, it's no longer human. It's precisely the opposite of human, actually. Dehumanizing, impersonal, human reified, turned into a thing, thingified, inhuman. So business, or even the United Nations, might be one category of organization, but how, you might ask, could anyone dream of applying this particular framework to education, especially to transnational education, least adapted to a one-size-fits-all model? Imagine asking a professor who's being interviewed to teach a class, tell us about a time when your communication skills made a difference to a situation. But of course, as many of you already know, this Anglo-Saxon model of management has already been applied to universities, which have been turned into businesses and students into customers, hence my talk a year ago at my thesis supervisor's retirement. This has dramatically changed the nature of work in universities, both in the US and the UK. If you want to read a very powerful book on the subject, anything written by the English writer Stefan Collini, who writes a lot in the London Review of Books, is outstanding. He collected all of these in a book entitled What Are Universities For? Human resource discourse doesn't just misunderstand education, it misunderstands human beings and the realities of work and life, which include power, politics, inequality, conflict, manipulation, deceit. It also ignores emotions: fear, insecurity, anxiety, satisfaction, boredom, frustration. And above all, it fails to see how work sits alongside the rest of life. Other priorities, other interests, other projects, friends, family. So in thinking about our professional identities and careers, using the discourse of human resources, we're wielding a shockingly blunt instrument ill-suited to our purposes. But the question is, what else can we use? And I love the fact that with Sasha and Patrick's introductions, this conference will not solely be limited to human resources, but what I notice is it's so easy for us to slip into that paradigm, and I just want us to be aware of that. So I think that I'm going to listen very carefully to the other papers and to the discussions, because I think we're already moving outside of this paradigm, and that's a very positive development. I would like to offer just one approach that I find useful for revealing the truths and realities of our various careers, and that is the category of gender. Drawing on the work of feminist scholars in the past several decades, I use gender as a concept to reveal, on the one hand, the underlying logic of human resources, and on the other hand, the hidden structures of power in work relationships. In human resources discourse, gender exists in the concepts gender discrimination, sexual harassment, and parental leave, all legal and policy issues, in other words. And these are very important, but these legal categories are not my interest here. First then, the underlying logic of HR. HR purports to be gender neutral, but it's not neutral at all. As feminist scholars of work and organizational behavior have pointed out, gender is not just about individuals. It's a systemic factor in organizations, influencing not only men and women, but also the very knowledge that underlies our beliefs about what makes for good workers, good work, and successful organizations. So it's that underneath level that I'd like to get at. Joan Acker, in her seminal essay from 1991, Hierarchies, Jobs, and Bodies, explains it this way. The job is the basic unit in an organization's hierarchy. An empty slot an abstract category like the hierarchy itself. No gender, no body, neutral. The assumption is meritocratic. Anyone qualified can fill the job. Anyone can move up the hierarchy if they pass their competency-based interview. The impersonal and the abstract are neutral and fair, but, Acker explains, quote, in organizational logic, filling the abstract job is a disembodied worker who exists only for the work. Too many obligations outside the boundaries of the job would make a worker unsuited for the position. She points out, as feminist scholars have been doing for the past 30 years, that we still have the perception and the reality of separate spheres, the domestic or private personal sphere coded feminine, the professional and public sphere coded masculine. The very category of job is anything but gender neutral, because the ideal neutral worker turns out to be a man, either with no outside commitments or with a wife who takes care of them for him. As Simone de Beauvoir said, back in the 1940s, man is neutral, woman is the sex. This places enormous pressure on both men and women, although in very different ways. Moreover, as Acker puts it, those who are committed 100% to paid employment will naturally rise to the top of the hierarchy because they are naturally more suited to responsibility and authority. Those who must divide their commitments are in the lower ranks. Statistics on female heads of organizations, not to mention the gender pay gap, certainly would bear this out. So these structural inequities at the core of rational management in human resources, I think, have major implications for those of us employed in study abroad education. Peopled as it is by far more women than men, and I notice that in this room it's about 3-to-1 women to men, and by a faculty workforce that is largely part-time or adjunct, and by a variety of employee profiles, from host country natives to expats, long-term residents to new arrivals, and all the complexities of our plural, in-between, and hybrid identities. The structural inequities resulting from this presumed neutrality of job and hierarchy are one thing. Far more shocking are the more overt gender stereotypes and biases deployed by human resources management, even when they say they're not using them. And here's an anecdote that I have debated whether or not to tell you, and so now I must tell you. In New York State, a male friend of mine who works for a large multinational organization last year was asked to complete a very detailed questionnaire on his management and leadership style. This turns out to be a standardized human resources instrument that has been recently developed, and it has been taken, according to the website of this company, by over 40 million people globally. It asks, what kind of manager or leader are you? The initial questions are, give us your name, your gender, your email, go. It takes quite a long time to do. So my friend took this test. Turns out this is what he wants. Freedom from controls that restrict his creativity. He wants to explore new ideas, and he wants to have the authority to test his findings. He wants sincere appreciation for his achievements. He wants the authority to install systems and to achieve results. He wants to be seen as a leader. He wants the prestige, position, and titles so he can control the destiny of others. These are all classic features. I mean, just listen to the language: freedom, creativity, explore, authority, achievements, leader, prestige, position, all classic descriptors of heroic leadership. He was quite curious that there were no personal questions asked about his age, his educational background, his nationality, so he went to a different laptop. He logged in under a woman's name, ticked the box female, answered every question the same, and guess what happened? She was looking for the opportunity to verbalize her ideas and demonstrate her skills. She likes to talk. She looked for opportunities to discuss projects, to discuss progress on projects. She likes to talk. She was looking for new challenges and problems to solve. She liked evaluation based on the bottom line. She's very practical. Above all, instead of controlling the destiny of others, she wanted to control her own destiny. Literally, those were the words. She liked meetings that stayed on agenda. She was very practical, very hands-on. Now, I'm just going to leave that there because I'm running out of time, and I want to make sure I've just got a few more bits to do. My second use of gender, to borrow the words of historian Joan W. Scott. Gender is a useful category of analysis because masculine and feminine are primary ways of signifying unequal relationships of power. And in study abroad education, we are enmeshed in a number of power relations that potentially feminize our work or situate us in a seemingly less valuable, weaker position. Let me just sort of sketch some of the possibilities quickly, and if there's time for discussion, we can bring more of them up. First, the relation between home campus and abroad frequently positions us as the wife, the secretary, and increasingly as the nurse or babysitter, to the extent that students today are less independent and more medicated. Camille, I know, is going to talk a little bit about this later. Second, jobs within a study abroad center are inflected with power and gendered meanings. Different departments within a study abroad center, IT, for example, student life, masculine, feminine, potentially. What about the expectations we have of center directors to embody certain features of heroic leadership coded as masculine? The very first time that I met Sasha, within 5 minutes, we were talking about this particular subject. The often gendered and hierarchical assumptions of the relationship between faculty and staff, for example, which for me is really quite complicated in a study abroad center because staff, every staff member I know is also a teacher in their way with students. And faculty in study abroad centers often play a much greater pastoral role. So those lines between faculty and staff abroad are blurred in ways that they are not on home campus. Third, the relationship between faculty and students. As Sasha pointed out in her introduction, teaching has changed, and that masculine model of the authoritative, active lecturer no longer works with today's generation of learners. We now call it student-centered learning. I think that this trend raises very significant identity issues for faculty, and to be quite frank, it's going to be particularly difficult for men of a certain generation, but for others too, I think, because such a pedagogy is unconsciously coded as feminine, associated with a lack of power and authority, and inappropriate to the workplace. That's the perception. And further, because it's feminine, it's often assumed that it requires no skill or competence, that this way of teaching is natural and unskilled. And then finally, the last sort of element of gender and power I would bring up is the changing population of students. Women still outnumber men in study abroad, but that's changing, and it's certainly not true in business studies, which is the fastest growing discipline and population of study abroad. And how will the presence of more male students change this demographic? So these are a few of the ways that the category of gender helps me. It doesn't have to help you, but it certainly helps me see more of the realities of our working lives. And the human resources paradigm simply can't deal with them. I'm not advocating the rejection of human resources or calling those who use it sexist or a Nazi. Sometimes human resources delivers what it promises: impartiality, fairness, legal protections. It's also embedded in organizations, and we couldn't entirely avoid it if we tried. But we must use human resources language cautiously. We must use the legal paradigm skeptically, self-consciously, and strategically. And we must be aware of the blind spots, the specificities and complexities of our roles in study abroad education, as I've talked about, the hidden power dynamics of our working relationships, our personal histories, the workplace realities of emotion, insecurity, irrationality, ego. Finding ways of thinking and talking about these realities might, after all, get us closer to that which we call human.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure you want to apply as an HR manager in your next job. But you could write an HR book.
I could, yes, I could write an HR book. I actually, when I interviewed for the HR job at the Boeing company, after about sort of 10 minutes, he said, "Do you really want this job?" And I said,
No.
"No." That's why I didn't get it. I didn't fail the question.
I'm really glad you brought all this up. I quickly touched on it last year in my overview, and I don't trust me at all because I'm very bad with numbers. I think in one of the slides of my presentation last year, I pointed out that 75% of the entire production of HR manuals are produced in the States. So the
Yep.
HRM culture is U.S. North American culture.
Absolutely.
So, thank
Absolutely.
you. So we have very few minutes, unfortunately. Anyone would like to comment? Ask.
I think it's more a comment, sort of a question, but the whole idea of the gendered language of HR, I am thinking about a lot in terms of more of, let's say, an Italian context of the language of HR, where sometimes those gender roles are even extreme versions of what you're talking about, and sometimes they're flipped around. And so I'm just trying to sort of get my brain around how one thinks about, in a way, I come from a US perspective, and so those are very strictly defined gender roles in a way that come out, let's say, through that test that you're talking about. But I'm just wondering, in terms of a UK-based context, or in terms of an Italian context, how you've thought about the changes that come about in your perception of those gendered HR terms.
I'd love to hear more about the Italian context and how it differs from but the UK is not any different than the US, I would say. I mean, I'm generalizing, but it really is an Anglo-Saxon model, and the UK is aping the United States in all kinds of ways. But I would be very curious how, a Latin culture like Italy would potentially change that. I mean, my partner is French, and so we have lots of conversations, about sort of Gallic culture versus Anglo-Saxon culture, and there are just really profound differences. So I would be very curious to hear what some of the, when you sort of talk about what's happening in the Italian maybe we can sort of carry this conversation on throughout today and tomorrow. As you said, you're sort of wrapping your mind around it, but if anyone else wants to jump in, where potentially the discourse of human resources feels different in Italy and is different partly because of language.
One of the problems I have with the title of our conference is Human Capital Management. Yeah. But I think we need to keep that title because it attracts people to come and listen.
Yes.
But I've been in administration for years, and I've never been able to accept the thought that you can manage persons. We can manage environments where persons are invited to do their best work and are supported in doing that. And but I constantly hear about how well do you manage that? You didn't manage that faculty member very well. Well, wait a minute. I mean, I don't think you can. I mean, I think that we can do a review, but there has to be a situation of, again, a mutual sympathy and influence and listening, and so.
And also a reminder of what the ultimate objective is, and I think too often is, well, what is in the best interest of the organization? Well, yes, but sometimes I think, well, what's in the best interest of, the professor or the staff member or the administrator, what's in their best interest in terms of their own career? And that's often a question that is subordinated to the larger organizational goal, assuming that we even all agree on what that is to begin with.
But I really appreciate the move you've made toward gender as a category for analyzing the study abroad situation in terms of...
It's the beginnings, and it requires a lot more thought and a lot more work. I don't want to throw the category around sort of carelessly, but my instinct and my training tells me there's something very valuable in it, that it actually could explain certain things and help us understand certain things much better. And so it's worth pursuing, I think. So I'll probably continue to pursue it.
I wish you would.
And also the interesting part is there are two discourses here, because we intellectually, I want to think we agree on all of this and want to explore this even further. But then when the three of us go back to our administrative life, then we have to deal with contracts and legal matters.
Yes,
and
we do. Oh, I could, when I need
so
to.
that this is a double,
Absolutely.
the two discourses, but yet we are aware, and that's why we're here, and we try to find ways out.
And when you're using that language, even to describe yourself, or because you're an administrator, and sometimes I do put on my HR hat and I hear the language coming out of my mouth. I think the key is to sort of be aware of that language, right? So that it's not using you, but you actually kind of know when to step out of it and what it's incapable of doing, what it can do, and sometimes it can do some very effective things, but what it cannot do as well.